Shane. Yeah, we are going to go over our test this week. It's about as specific as I can be right now. Yeah. Quick review. We've gone through lots of cell parts. Lots of them were part of something called the endomembrane system, which you should be looking over every once in a while to make sure you keep that in your brain because we've moved on. But remember, that's the system that takes like newly made proteins from the nucleus and moves them around and ships them in vesicles to various places, including out of the cell. The main trunk of that system being the ER and the Golgi apparatus, side trips being various vesicles, lysosomes, and vacuoles. Then we talked about the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, which we kind of kept it simple, that it releases energy from food, specifically glucose. We'll get into that more deeply in a couple chapters. What we focused on was the weird stuff about it, which was that it's got a double membrane, it's got its own DNA and ribosomes, and divides on its own. Like you don't make more mitochondria, they make more of themselves. And finally, we figured out why. Riley came up big in figuring out why you only get your mitochondria from your mom. It's because sperm cells, while they have tons of mitochondria, they're all in the tail. The tail doesn't make it into the cell that becomes the offspring. So today we clean up. We talk about the last two organelles, one of which is complex and one of which is not. They happen to both be organelles that are only in plant cells. What's the one that's showing there? Do you know the name of the green organelle, Caleb? Chloroplast. That is the chloroplast. Good. Next chapter, you will learn about the chloroplast and how it does what it does. But the short story is it makes sugars using the sun's energy. And what raw material? Where does it get the stuff it makes sugars out of? Sun. The sun provides the energy. What provides the actual stuff?
Is this like the smarter than a Harvard
Yes.
nitrogen?
No, it is the smarter than a Harvard graduate, but that's not what it was. Remember, it was like, where did trees get their mass? Carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They get it out of thin air. It's amazing, right? So that's photosynthesis. Again, next chapter, you'll learn more than you ever wanted to know. So again, we'll keep that simple and talk about the weird stuff, which happens to be almost exactly the same weird stuff as mitochondria. The chloroplast has a double membrane. It has little green stacks of membranes called thylakoids. We'll get into that, but not now. But that's where the photosynthesis actually happens. But that double membrane, and then same stuff, its own DNA, its own ribosomes, and the ability to reproduce independently of the cell. Which is weird that you've got, well, that a plant cell has two different organelles, because they have mitochondria as well. They don't just need to make sugars, they also have to break them down for energy. Two different things inside it, plant cells have, that kind of look like little stowaways, little critters, little bacteria with their own DNA doing their own thing. So back to that in a second. The other thing only plants have is, what's the other cell part plant cells have that animal cells don't? That would be a cell wall. Good. Now, not to say that other kinds of cells don't have these. It's just animals don't. Turns out fungi have their own cell walls. Bacteria have their own cell walls. They're just made out of different stuff than plant cell walls. Plant cell walls are made of a carbohydrate called cellulose. It's the stuff that makes them crunchy. Yeah, you eat celery, you're eating mostly cellulose. Not real easy for us to digest. It's why it costs you more energy to eat a stick of celery than you actually get from breaking it down. Why do they have cell walls? It's the same reason they have those pressurized water tanks, pressurized water vacuoles in the middle of their cells. It's because a plant's body plan is tall and skinny, lots of leaves on top. That's very vulnerable, and so they need as much stiffness as they can get. That's what cell walls are for. It's just outside the cell membrane, that cell wall is, so they've still got a cell membrane. They just got that tough cell wall outside it. It's all about rigidity. It's all about stiffness. Of course, that is also the reason that you don't see trees walking around like in the Lord of the Rings. What is this called? The walkie trees in Lord of the Rings. Is it Ents? They're in the Ents? Yeah. And just so you don't think this is an only plants thing, let's write down that we also have cell walls in fungi and bacteria. They're just made of different stuff. So now we get to the weirdness, the fact that there's these two organelles that seem like they're kind of a breed apart from everything else, the mitochondria and the chloroplast. And we head back to the 1970s and a scientist named Lynn Margulis. And Lynn Margulis in the 1970s was basically, it hadn't been that long that we realized what mitochondria and chloroplasts actually even are. And she's looking at them and thinking, man, that's weird. How would you get two little stowaways like that inside a cell? Obviously didn't happen recently. Living things have been evolving with their little mitochondria and chloroplasts for millions of years at least. So how did it happen? And why do they both have a double membrane? That doesn't seem to have anything to do with the other stuff. Okay, they're independent. They've got their own DNA, their own ribosomes, reproduce independently. That speaks to them being their own cells at some point in history. But why the double membrane? And then the aha moment comes when she sees a giant one-celled organism called an amoeba. And she sees that amoeba eat. You know what an amoeba is? Anybody? I mean, it's a cell, but it's a cell that kind of bends around. It's got an extensive cytoskeleton that can help it change shape, and so that's actually how it moves. It just kind of oozes from place to place. This is this big cell, like a millimeter wide, like it's a big cell. It's got its nucleus, but what she saw was an amoeba eating its lunch, basically. She saw under a microscope an amoeba ooze its way up to something it wanted to eat. This is just one cell, mind you. This is not an animal. This is a cell. And saw that amoeba use its microfilaments, not that she knew what those were, but she saw it bend its cell membrane around the thing it wanted. And to the point where the two edges of the bending actually came together and pinched off. Remember, because the fluid mosaic means it's all fluid. Like it's like, you know how when two soap bubbles hit each other and they become one? It's like that. And so suddenly this amoeba has something that was outside it, inside it now. And all it's got to do now is say maybe fuse a little lysosome with that has some digestive chemicals, and it's got its food, right? Riley.
How long does that take? Is it like a quick 5-minute thing?
Yeah. 5 minutes is a good, maybe a little less, maybe 2-3 minutes. But it's something you can watch happen. Definitely. And a light bulb comes on when she goes, oh, what if instead of eating a little chunk of food, what if that amoeba was going after a little bacterium? A little one-celled, with its own loop of DNA, bacterium, and started to bend its membrane around it, right? And bends its membrane around it. You see where this is going? Where's it going? What are we going to find? What's that bacterium going to have once it makes it inside? Maybe, yeah, that's part of this. Well, let me finish it. What do you notice about that bacterium now? It's got a double membrane. And she went, crap, what if the double membrane is evidence of that ancient event where this thing got taken in by this thing? What if this now picture this thing, we're talking about mitochondria, what if that little guy is really good at breaking sugars down and produces so much energy from that it doesn't need all of it and supplies the big guy with some of that energy? What if this big guy is really good at eating stuff, right? Which means that the more that big guy takes in, the more there is for this little guy to break down for energy, and they both benefit from an energy. So all it takes is both of them to do better than their neighbors, and you've got an evolutionary trend. And that's the endosymbiotic theory. Basically says this, that mitochondria and chloroplasts have these things we've been saying, double membranes, their own DNA, and their own ribosomes. And since then, since she came up with this, what at the time was a hypothesis, we've actually dug into that DNA and those ribosomes and found, yeah, the sequences of DNA and RNA in those things, totally bacterial. They totally are the descendants of the ancient bacteria that did this in the first place. And since we got good at sequencing DNA and reading it, we can actually trace mitochondrial DNA all the way back to ancient bacteria, directly related. Add to that the fact they reproduce themselves in a way that, by the way, looks just like bacterial division. It's called binary fission. It's simpler than mitosis. Basically, this says that mitochondria and chloroplasts were once free-living bacteria. They were on their own at some point. And by prokaryotes, you remember what I mean, right? No nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles, smaller bacteria, basically. And that those free-living prokaryotes at some point got engulfed, like I showed you. Or, I mean, there are bacteria that can trick their way into cells, either way, whether it was the bacteria or the big guy. Whether it got swallowed or tricked its way inside to intending to parasitize the cell, all it takes is that the little guy doesn't get broken down by the big guy, but instead both of them benefit from the relationship. When I first started teaching, that was in textbooks as the endosymbiotic hypothesis. It is now in textbooks as the endosymbiotic theory. That is a progression from being one idea among several to being the best explanation we have at this point. Evidence strongly supports that that's how it went down. The big guy swallowed the little guy, and they evolved to work together. That's a big one. That's right up there with cell membrane stuff, right? The fluid mosaic model. That's like things that you're likely to get an essay question about. So, yeah, I'd say the big three are fluid mosaic model, endomembrane system, and tracing something through it, and this right here. So make sure that this makes sense. Ask questions if it doesn't. Do you have any questions? Okay, yeah.
So when the bacteria goes into the amoeba or whatever cell it goes into, that's like infected.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly bacteria that infect big cells. Yeah, that process may have even been started like that, but this time it just didn't. Instead of infecting it, it actually evolved with it.
Would we be drawing the fluid mosaic or like?
Yeah, I'd want you to be able to draw the phospholipids with that and the fluid mosaic stuff. Yeah.
So does it stay like that, like where it's just like the amoeba, the amoeba like wrapped around the cell, or does it like eventually like evolve to just like two of the cell?
Yeah, well, so this is an early one-celled organism, right? That becomes a eukaryote by getting stuff like this inside it.
Yeah.
But then the next step is, multicellularity and sexual reproduction, all that stuff comes later. But this would have come before that.
Right.
Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, because I really want you to understand your cell parts. The first step to that was your analogy project, the dream house and the coloring page, which I'd like you to get out now. No, we're not going any. And just make sure your name is on both of them. And I'm going to pass around the stapler. You can just staple the coloring page to the greenhouse. Make sure your name's on them. Coloring is kind of the important part. I always say, when I encourage students like you to be in study groups with each other, I say things like, you never understand something as well as when you have to teach it to someone else. That's why study groups are great. You take turns teaching each other the material, and you learn whether you really understand it. But I'll take it a step further. Being a parent, you never understand something as well as when you have to explain it to an 8-year-old. Oh my God. The first time Isaac said, "What are we made of?" And I said, "Cells." And he said, "What's a cell?" And I went, like every description I could think of was using words that he had never heard before, right? So there's actually one of my favorite web comic drawers. He does sciencey, nerdy web comics. Has taken that problem on. He wrote a book called Thing Explainer, where he explains like the most complicated scientific models there are, including a model of a cell, which is what you're about to see, using only the 1,000 most commonly used English words. Oh my gosh, it's hard. Try and do it sometime. There's actually, I'll show you a text editor where it limits you to only those words. And by the way, 1,000 isn't one of them, so he calls it the 1,000 most used English words. But this right here is him explaining a cell and all the parts that make it work in just those simple words. And so I've made it into an activity where you've got to take these numbered cell parts, read his descriptions of them, and on the back, you're going to number 1 through 11 and identify what those actual cell parts are. The print is very small. You need glasses. You should have them on. And if I can read it, you can read it. And so to title the thing, of course, he says, "Tiny bags of water you're made of," which is close to what I came up with for Isaac. I think I said, they're like little bags of goo that are all glued together to make you. And he went, "Ew, Dad." This is probably better. Yeah, so go ahead and get to work on that. I'll give you the rest of the period and have it done for tomorrow. There's only 11, but you really got to kind of know what's going on in order to correctly identify them.